So we're going to do, we're going to do a little review so that you feel ready for your test. So I'm looking at our class notebook. This might not be your class, so it might be a tiny bit different, but this will give us the information we need. So remember, we started this term by talking about the French and Indian War. So the main things we need to remember about those are who won. So first of all, it was the French and a lot of Native American groups. And they fought against the British. Okay, the British won that war. So remember that Britain defeated France and its native allies. And the result was that Britain won control of that land. Remember, there was land to the west past the Appalachian Mountains that they wanted access to. And they won it in this war. We'll talk more about it when we go to the next slide. But that was the result of this war. One thing to remember that I don't think we included on our slide was that George Washington was a lieutenant from the British Army in this war. So he was involved with that. Remember that George Washington was involved with the French and Indian War. We saw that in one of our Ed puzzles. That will come up on your test. And the groups that fought with them is going to come up, and we don't have that on here either. So we're going to want to remember that the Iroquois Native Americans fought with the British, and the Algonquian and the Huron Native Americans, the Algonquian and the Huron fought with the French during the French and Indian War. So those are some important details that are both on and not on our slide, so we want to remember those. Okay, so we do have one more slide about the French and Indian War, and that does have George Washington on there, so we have that detail. But then it's moving us on to the Proclamation of 1763. So remember, after the French and Indian War, the British won the land out past the Appalachian Mountains west of it, and they wanted to move out that way. But the proclamation the king created stopped that. They weren't allowed to do that because Native people were already living there, and he didn't want more fighting. So he said, just stay on this side of the mountains and everything should be fine. Okay, so the colonists were very dissatisfied with this because they were not able to settle west of the Appalachian Mountains and were very upset by it. Britain did it to try to protect the American settlers from more fighting with the native people, but the colonists didn't view it that way. So the Proclamation of 1763 is what kind of made them have to stay in one area or in their area, even though many of them did not listen to that. Our next thing that happened was the Stamp Act and the Sugar Act. The colonists were very upset with both of these acts, especially the Stamp Act, and protested largely against it, leading to it being repealed. We have that in here. I mean, the king took it away. He said, okay, forget it. I can see how upset you are. I will take away the Stamp Act. So he did eventually do that. And remember, the Stamp Act was the act that required the colonists to pay a tax on all printed items. So remember, it was like newspapers, magazines, legal documents, like all of their paper they were going to have to pay a tax on. Remember, it was not on stamps. Nope. It was because they stamped a piece of paper to show that you had paid the tax on it. Okay, this leads us to the Quartering Act and the Townshend Acts. So remember, more and more things were being passed by the king to try to recoup those expenses, to try to get the taxes to repay for the war. So the Quartering Act, I hope you remember, but that's the one passed by the government that forced colonists to provide food, transportation, housing, all those things for the soldiers, and had to let them into their own homes. So that was very upsetting for the colonists. And the Townshend Acts were more taxes, right, on glass, lead, paper, tea, paint, all of these things. And this was getting the colonists very, very upset, which was going to bring us soon to the Sons of Liberty. So next, we're on to colonist ideals. Yes, where the people kind of start splitting their opinions. right? So on your test, you're going to have the same as you did on your exit ticket, where you have to read the little story about the person and decide, are they loyalists, neutrals, or patriots? Remember, the Sons of Liberty were a patriot group, right? They were wanted to be fully American. They wanted to start their own country. The loyalists were the people that still were loyal to the king. They were usually like upper class citizens, usually nonviolent. They wanted to stay wealthy, and usually that happened by staying in touch with England. The patriots were normally more working people or lower class people. They wanted freedom. They did not want to be controlled by England. So that's their main difference. And then we have our neutralists, who were kind of in the middle, or were kind of too far away to really be involved with what's going on. So as mentioned, we have our patriots, who are organizing the Sons of Liberty, which is that group that was very outspoken and violent when they needed to be, to try to get change to come about. Remember, Samuel Adams was one of the main founders of this. We've mentioned his name quite a few times. It's here as well, and you'll be seeing his name on your test, so be looking for that. As mentioned, you're going to be reading through some of these options of what people, if they were loyalist, neutral, or patriot. So let me give you a little example. I'll start just by reading part of one from your test. So this is one directly from your test. It says, Colonist A is a poor farmer in the Hudson Valley of New York. So poor makes me think maybe he's a patriot, but I'm going to keep reading. Colonist A has paid no attention to the trouble brewing in the colonies. That makes me think one. If he's paying no attention, would he be a loyalist, a neutral, or a patriot? Remember, neutral are the colonists that were too far away or embraced both sides. So right now he's sounding like a neutralist. His day-to-day struggle to maintain his farm and family is what worries him. He doesn't have time to get involved. His problems have gotten worse. His landowner is a loyalist. He has some financial troubles. He barely earns enough. He will get evicted. Okay, so he has a lot of problems, but mostly what he's worrying about right now is just those problems. So for this one, I would choose neutral, because this person is having a hard time, but they aren't taking a side. They're still not paying attention to the trouble that's brewing. So that would be a huge hint that it's a neutralist. If there's one that says something such as someone has a lot of wealth and honor and those sorts of things, that's almost always a loyalist in history. And then someone who's maybe a working class person and someone who's upset about the taxes, that would be our patriot. So keep that in mind as you're working through those questions, because I know those were tricky for some of you on your exit ticket. I'm realizing I forgot to mention the treaty. So let me see. The Proclamation of 1763, I forgot to talk about the Treaty of Paris. So the Treaty of Paris in 1763, remember, that was the official end of the war. It's like a document that was signed that showed the French and Indian War is over. We both agreed we're signing this document to show, we're signing the Treaty of Paris to show that the French and Indian War is over. And it's important to note that when that was signed, it was signed by Benjamin Franklin. So I think we mentioned that, but it didn't make it to our slide. So remember that for your test. Benjamin Franklin signed the Treaty of Paris in 1763. Okay, so we're going to get back to what we were. We were getting up to the Boston Massacre. So remember, the Boston Massacre was not as deadly as people make it sound. Patriots are the people that would call it a massacre because they were trying to get people to be upset like them. So that's where the name came from. The massacre part was more of a propaganda word to get people to really pay attention to what was going on in Boston. So colonists would have been the people to refer to this as a massacre. And remember, this was when the British soldiers shot and killed American colonists. So this was a very tragic event in history, just maybe not necessarily a massacre, because 5 people died as a result of this. And normally a massacre refers to many, many people dying. This obviously really, really was kind of one of the last straws for the colonists because their lives now felt like they were in danger. They were. And this is going to bring us up to the Tea Party and the Tea Act. So these were pretty major events. Remember, everything we're talking about is leading up to the Revolutionary War. So we're almost to war times here. So things are getting tense. So we have the Tea Act, where the king proclaimed that people could only buy their tea from East India Tea Company, and people were very upset by this monopoly, which led us to the Tea Party. Remember, the Tea Party is when the colonists dressed like native people and climbed aboard the ships and dumped it into the Boston Harbor. So remember, that was the main thing, is they dressed up like like the native people and went aboard the ship and threw it into the Boston Harbor. So pretty major, major thing happening there. Because of this, the Intolerable Acts were passed, which we'll look at in just a second. But that was the laws passed to punish the colonists for what they did. The Tea Party happened mostly because people in England viewed the experience differently. So the colonists thought that people should have a voice in their government. They wanted this new way of life. They no longer wanted a king in charge of them. And the English people were used to that. So that difference in opinion kind of contributed to our problem as well. But it's important to remember that the Patriots were really, really fighting for people to have a voice in their government. They thought that was important above all else. One thing that we don't have on here that will be on your test is about the First Continental Congress. So remember, that's the group that was kind of leading the way. They were the ones doing the meetings. They were the ones making plans in the colonies, trying to decide how to deal with all the stuff the king was doing. So they organized in 1774, so right after the Boston Tea Party. They organized in response to the Intolerable Acts. So this is their first attempt at trying to unify the colonies. And it happened because of the Intolerable Acts. They all thought they were so horrible, they kind of banded together. They opposed them, and they worked together to try to change the way that things were being run in the colonies. All right, so that's kind of our review. I know it was long, but it will really, really help you if you use this video while you're taking your test. One last thing to remind you is that the colonists had different opinions, right? We had our patriots, we had our loyalists, we had our neutralists. So one of our questions asks us, what would the colonists do if they were taxed? And remember, they would do different things because they had different beliefs. So some of them would pay them, some of them wouldn't, some of them rebelled, some of them moved. So remember that when you're taking your test. So feel free to watch this and look through it as your test taking to help you do your best.